In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the readings for this week. So this week, I've got you reading chapters 1 and 2 from Alain Bala's book, The Dialogue of Civilizations and the Birth of Modern Science. So he starts off by talking a little bit about what's called, somewhat melodramatically, the science wars. This isn't really a war. It's a discussion that's been ongoing since about the 1990s about the status of science, and particularly whether science is universal. And by universal, what we mean is something that's like the best way of producing knowledge for everyone. Now, I think it's pretty clear that there's some things that are not universal. So there's differences in the way food is prepared all over the world. And it seems pretty clear to me that there's not just one best way to prepare, say, noodles, right? So there's many, many different noodle recipes all over the world. And there's not just like one ultimate noodle recipe that everybody's converging on, right? So the question of the science wars is science like that, but for knowledge, right? So there are many ways of producing knowledge, many ways of gaining knowledge. And there are people on one side of this debate that say science is just the best way for everyone to produce knowledge. Science is universal. It's universally the ideal way to generate knowledge about the natural world. And then there's people on the other side of this debate that deny that science is universal in that way. They want to say science is like noodles. There's many ways of producing knowledge, and your way is not necessarily better than anybody else's way. So if somebody comes to knowledge through deep meditation or religious ritual or sort of long cultural tradition, those are all different ways of generating knowledge. And there's not just one best way. These are just there's just a diversity of ways of coming to knowledge. So the debate is between universalists about science who think that it's the best for everybody, and people who deny universalism who think that it's not necessarily the best for everybody. So on one side of this debate, we've got the postmodern critique, as Bala puts it, and he says the following. He says, these critics reject, the postmodernists, reject the commonly held view that current science is a culture-neutral enterprise of universal and cosmopolitan reach, and the common heritage of humanity, despite its historical genesis within the geographical confines of Europe. So modern science, it seems pretty clear to historians of science, did get rolling in roughly Renaissance Europe. Maybe a bit past that. So the scientific revolution takes place more or less in Europe. And the postmodern critique of science says, well, that kind of culturally, geographically limited origin tells us that it's sort of like a noodle recipe. It's one way of doing it. It's not the only way. So when you've got sort of traditional forms of knowledge, you can't say that science is in any sense better than those. So broadly speaking, postmodernism is the idea that there's not one overarching framework that all of our knowledge can be fitted into. So for a long time, people fit all of our knowledge into a religious framework, or Marxists put all of the world into a Marxist framework, and so on. So these are called meta-narratives, overarching narratives that are supposed to collect up all of the knowledge and sort of organize it into one unified whole. And postmodernists have traditionally denied, the one thing that postmodernism as a overarching theory has in common is that they've denied that there's any one universal framework that we can legitimately fit all of our knowledge and cultural practices into. So when you say, science is universal, it's for everybody, it's from everybody, it's this kind of human practice that's unlike noodle recipes. There's a best way of doing it for everybody. Postmodernists are going to deny that. And on the other side of the debate, you have modernists. A modernist might say something like this. So again, from Bala. Their stance is vehemently rejected by modernists who view any accommodation of traditional knowledge as embracing archaic, mythical, superstitious, and irrational systems of thought. Okay, so Bala is not really going to accept either of these views. He thinks both of these are in some sense deeply one-sided. Right? So he does accept that science is a kind of common heritage of humanity, but he's going to reject the idea that it's specific to Europe in any important way. So the argument that he makes throughout this book is that we've been mistelling the history of science. That is, the history of science is very often told in this way that presupposes that it's just a product of European culture. Whereas if you actually look at where the preconditions for science come from, the building blocks that went into constructing modern science, you find that they come from all over the world. They actually are a common heritage of humanity. And they're put together in a unique way in Europe during the Renaissance or the Scientific Revolution, but they come from everywhere. So he's going to make the argument, so he's going to reject both of these pictures, both a Eurocentric modernist view that says modern science, which is the best way of getting knowledge for everyone, was discovered in Europe. And he's going to reject that. He's also going to reject the postmodernist relativist picture that says whatever way of knowledge you've got is just as good as any other way. And the way he's going to find a way through those views, he's going to find a third way through those views by talking about what he calls the dialogical origins of science. That is to say, he's going to trace out, when you actually look at the history of science and where the technologies and ideas came from, you find that they're global. Their origins come from all over. So, with quite a bit of evidence, he's going to argue throughout this book that the origins of modern science, if you look at where they come from, are global. Okay, so what this means is that we can actually accept that science is universal. It's not something culturally specific like what's the best way to produce noodles. It's not something that comes from one specific time and place. Actually, it's the accumulation of knowledge from all over the world, without saying that it's kind of essentially European. And what he needs to do to make this case is to show how knowledge is transported and moved and developed across different cultures from different times and places all over. Okay, so that's the basic introduction. That's him introducing his basic argument, the position that he's going to develop throughout the rest of the book. So the first intro chapter is very short. He's really just saying what he's going to try to argue. The rest of the book is presenting the argument for that position, that dialogical picture of the origins of modern science. So in chapter 2, he goes on to ask the following question. Why did modern science not develop in civilization X, where X is a variable? Why didn't it develop here or there or the other place? And he's going to do something sort of philosophical here. You might say historiographic or something like that. He's going to ask us to think about whether this is a good question and to ask us to look at the ways people have tried to answer it. So he's going to look at a couple of examples of people asking this question. Now, he's going to say that we wouldn't even be asking this question if we thought that science was in some sense culturally specific. So nobody asks why Europe didn't develop a Chinese art style, right? So there's a kind of specific way of, not a specific, but there are trends in Chinese art, styles of representation, and nobody thinks, well, why didn't Europe develop that in the 1200s or something like that? We accept that art styles, like ways of preparing noodles, are culturally specific. So in asking this question, why didn't modern science develop, for example, in China, what we're doing is assuming the universality of science, which is one of the things that Bala is going to try to get us to accept and maybe not assume, but accept after argument. So we know there's lots of different styles of art. We don't ask, why didn't, Japanese printmaking develop in the Aztec Empire? That's just not a question that we ask because we accept that there's not just one best art style. Right? So, and he's gonna actually kind of try to undermine one of the assumptions of the question by saying the following. Were it acknowledged that such a dialogue contributed to both the birth and growth of modern science, that is the dialogue of civilizations, and that contemporary science grew by standing on the shoulders of earlier non-European traditions, the question would seem pointless. So why didn't modern science develop in India? Well, it kind of did. Why didn't it develop in China? It sort of did. Or the Islamic world. Well, again, it did, in the sense that the building blocks that go into making modern science developed in all of those places just as much as it developed in Europe, and in some cases more. So he's going to actually reject this question. Why didn't it develop here? Well, if you look at the historical record, and he's going to lay out that record in the rest of the book, you find that a great deal of what went into modern science did develop in those cultures. Okay, so in some sense, he's going to accept the universalist assumption of the question that science is a common heritage of humanity, but he's going to reject the question itself because he thinks that science did develop all over the world. Okay, so that's his kind of answer, or at least reply to the question. He's going to question the question, very philosophical thing to do. He's also going to look at the way the story's been told by various historians. And he's specifically going to focus on, or especially going to focus on, this book by Colin Ronan, The Cambridge Illustrated History of the World's Sciences. The World's Science, sorry. He focuses on this book because it's one of the best examples of really taking seriously the idea that science is a global affair, that its development was global. And that's disturbingly rare, actually. So people who take the global history of science very seriously haven't sort of dominated the discussion so far. It's coming around to that. Increasingly, people are recognizing that science, the building blocks for science were developed all over the world, but there's not very much scholarship so far that takes this global picture. So Ronan's an example of somebody who works really hard to have a global history of science. And in that sense, Bala really respects what he's doing. But he's got a few concerns about the way he treats this question. Why didn't science develop in this and that civilization? So on the question of why didn't China develop modern science? And this is one of the more acute versions of this question, because China was in the 1500s, when sort of the beginnings of modern science begin to emerge in Europe, China's substantially more technologically developed than Europe. So, technologically, socially, in some senses, China's way ahead of Europe for a really long time. And the question is, okay, so why didn't they do science? And Ronan provides some answers to this question, now keeping in mind this is a question that Bala kind of rejects, but he wants to sort of look at what happens, maybe what goes wrong, when you answer this question in an unsophisticated way. So one of the reasons that Ronan proposes for why modern science didn't develop in China is Confucian bureaucracy. So Confucius is one of the most important figures in the history of Chinese thought, and there's a sort of bureaucracy that develops, a way of organizing society, essentially, around the principles of Confucius. And these are pretty carefully and specifically organized social relationships. So this sort of careful, specific social organization, Ronan suggests, is something that inhibited the development of modern science, which is supposed to be a little more freeform and experimental and rule breaking and that kind of thing. So the scientific spirit is very like, I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to try anything. We'll experiment with everything. And Ronan suggests that bureaucracy, specifically Confucian bureaucracy, put a damper on that scientific spirit. Okay, so that's one attempt to answer the question. Bala thinks this is not a good answer. So he points out that Europe at the time of the Renaissance had quite a bit of bureaucracy too. So here's a pretty famous bureaucrat. This is Niccolo Machiavelli. You might have heard of him from his famous book, The Prince, Machiavelli's The Prince. And he was appointed Chancellor of Florence in 1498, which is a bureaucratic position. And society in Europe was pretty organized around a bureaucracy. And it's a religious bureaucracy. So he's in Florence, where Galileo did his groundbreaking work, and he's, there's a kind of bureaucratic organization to society in Europe as well. So if you're saying bureaucracy inhibits science, that's not a good answer, because the place that's usually identified as the birth of modern science also had a bureaucracy. That's really not going to cut it as an answer. Similarly, well, not similarly, but like also, it's not a good answer because during this period of the ascendancy of Confucian bureaucracy, China comes up with some stunning scientific technological innovations. So the compass, for example, the magnetic compass, this little bowl with a fish in it, is a Chinese compass. That's an incredible invention. And it happened during this period that's supposedly stultified by Confucian bureaucracy. Or paper. So there's a guy making paper there. Or gunpowder. Like, all of these are incredible technological achievements for the time. And they all came out of this period that's supposedly being held back by lack of experimentation, lack of free thinking, that sort of thing. So it's very hard to reconcile the idea that free thinking was suppressed by by Confucian bureaucracy, and keeping in mind that these incredible technological developments are coming out of this very same society. So two good reasons why this part of Ronan's explanation for why science didn't evolve in China doesn't really work. Similarly, he asks why, another really good question, well, another pressing version of this question is, why didn't ancient or medieval India produce modern science? Again, a very sophisticated culture, a long sort of like history of developing mathematical, astronomical, technological innovations. So why didn't modern science come out of India? And Ronan attributes the failure, quote unquote, to develop modern science to either India or the Islamic world to the power of religion. So like pretty much every culture in the world at this point, India is highly religious. But there's a similar problem with this style of answer. So if religion is a stumbling block, if it's something that holds back the development of science, why did it take hold in Europe, which was similarly very religious when modern science begins to emerge? It's a different religion, but it's very religious. And we'll see that there's a consistently contentious relationship between science and religion, but by no means is religion just holding back science. That we'll talk about this when we talk about, for example, Galileo. So again, there's a kind of perhaps one-sidedness to Ronan's picture. So he looks at factors that existed in India, China, or the Islamic world and says, bureaucracy, religion, these things are holding back science. But those things also occur in Europe when modern science begins to emerge. So Ronan's answer is Bala thinks. So Bala talks about Ronan, tries to convince us that he's being one-sided, that he's being selective about how he explains the emergence or non-emergence of modern science. Okay, so that's just kind of a beginning of thinking about the way that we tell the story of history, the story of the history of science. Bala is going to continue in the next few chapters to talk about the way we have traditionally told the history of science and try to excavate how we got this way. So it's a story about stories that he's going to investigate a little bit, and then he'll go on to talk more specifically about the kinds of building blocks that get developed and traded all over the world. Okay. Thanks, everyone.